Hi, I'm John Resnikoff from University Archives, and today we're going to talk about an interesting aspect of my field, and that is facsimiles. I've talked to you in the past about forgeries, and forgeries are something that's created with malice. They're created to fool the collector. Whereas a facsimile is something that's printed or generated by the person in order to save that person the trouble of having to sign their name thousands or tens of thousands of times. Unfortunately, sometimes facsimiles make their way into the market and are sold by unscrupulous vendors as the real thing. And I'm going to talk to you about how to protect yourself. What I like to point out is something that I call a bicolor facsimile, which are particularly dangerous. So you could see that the blue is quite a different shade than the blue of the signature, and it looks like he really signed it. It really looks like ink. Now, one way to determine that this is not pen on paper would be to actually take the item, turn it over, and run your finger across the back to see if any pressure has created any indentation on the signature. And right here, I feel nothing. So here's another Kennedy facsimile that's bicolor. It's a White House card, and it has raised print here, you could feel it, and it has, "With best wishes, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States," underneath. So you have the blue White House and the black printing, not writing. Now, on a card like this, you can't really feel the back, it's too thick. So you got to take a close look at the front, get a magnifying glass on it, and you're going to look for where the letters cross over each other and see if there's extra ink where they cross over. Where the ink would cross, you'd want to see that it's a darker line than it would be with a single stroke. And if there isn't, that's also a good sign that it's a facsimile. One of the guides for me in determining that an Einstein is a facsimile is often the color of the blue ink isn't really blue, it's kind of like an aqua. And in this case, if you looked at it really close, you could see that there's no variation at all between the pressure. When somebody's writing their signature on a piece of paper, there will be different variations of the pressure applied to the paper, and here we don't see any of that, and that is a good indication. Another way to determine whether something is a facsimile or not is to take two that are in question, and if they match exactly, then you know what you have there is a facsimile, because nobody can write their name or a sentence the same way twice. So if one matches another example, you know you have a facsimile. So facsimiles are often easier to catch if you do a little research, because if you even put into Google the text of a letter and you find one that's exactly the same, you know what you have is a facsimile. There is a website, the Manuscript Society, that lists all the facsimiles that they have in their records, and that's a good starting spot if you suspect what you have is a facsimile. This is a Jimmy Carter letter that looks all handwritten. The first clue you'd have that this is a facsimile is 2 members of Congress. That's a lot of members. So he'd have to write this how many times, handwritten? Take up a lot of time for a president, wouldn't you think? Often you will see with facsimiles, if you look at the body of the letter, you might see that the addressee is typed in. Mr. Stern might be typed in, but the rest of the letter is printed. And who the letter is addressed to looks a little bit different than the body of the letter. That's a good tip that you have a form letter that's a facsimile. Here are a couple of my favorite facsimiles, and they actually have value and are collectible. And this is a very, very clever facsimile in that they actually printed the staining on the paper. They printed what the watermark would look like. They printed the docketing, and even where the folds are on the paper, they printed the toning. They did a really good job. And luckily, they printed on the back that it's a facsimile. They weren't trying to fool anybody. But then again, I've seen these in frames selling for $10,000 or $20,000, and an unsuspecting buyer might get duped on something like this. I've even seen where a seller will somehow try to eradicate the spot where it says it's a facsimile, or even burn it off, again to try to fool the unsuspecting buyer. One other thing that I've noticed about things that are facsimiles is that when there's a signature underneath a portrait, often it'll be perfectly spaced on either side, which the human eye and hand cannot do. So sometimes if you measure each side and it's exact, that's a good indication that it's a facsimile. The other thing to be careful of is anything that's behind glass or framed, because a lot of times you can't really tell as much when it's in that, when it has this covering it, you can't get right to the surface. You can't get close up enough with a magnifying glass. So take extra care when we're talking about something that's framed. The moral of the story is caveat emptor. Beware, be careful, do your research, deal with a good dealer, and you will not get stuck on buying a facsimile.